Welcome to the 1600 Sessions, a podcast presented by the White House Historical Association. In each episode, White House Historical Association President Stuart McLaurin interviews luminaries, historians, and eyewitnesses to history about America's most famous residence and office, the White House. We open the doors to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue because it's not only the President's house, it's the People's House. Michael Beschloss is an award-winning historian of the presidency. He's written 9 best-selling books and is a regular commentator for NBC, PBS, and the New York Times, where he provides historical context to presidential leadership and events in the White House.
You read these accounts of Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War, everything he had to deal with, and he would essentially open the door of his bedroom and he'd be in his nightcap and his long gown, and there'd be 90 people in the hallway waiting to bother him about getting a job for their brothers-in-law or changing the military strategy of the Civil War. He really had no peace. So if you had a White House where the president could not feel, any sense of calm, especially in wartime, that meant it wasn't doing its job.
Stuart McLaurin sat down for a conversation with Michael Beschloss to talk about some of his favorite stories from White House history and the important role the executive mansion plays, both symbolic and day-to-day, for presidents and the nation.
Welcome to today's podcast by the White House Historical Association from our offices on historic Lafayette Square overlooking the White House. We're talking today with Michael Beschloss, presidential historian. Michael, you are one of the most respected and certainly highly regarded historians on the American presidency, the White House itself. Why is studying and understanding the history of the White House important in your view?
Well, thanks for the nice words, Stuart. I think if you want to understand any of these presidents, with the exception of George Washington, of course, who did not have the privilege of living here, pretty hard to understand them unless you understand the setting. And the opposite is also true, because anyone who serves as president, even if they haven't been a long student of presidential history, they're almost compelled to understand it because they wake up upstairs in a room that other presidents have slept in, and they eat breakfast in a room that was Margaret Truman's bedroom at one point, and they go downstairs and they walk on Thomas Jefferson's colonnade over to the Oval Office, which a lot of people think is some federal period office when in fact it's Art Deco from the 1930s, Franklin Roosevelt. So even just in that small walk, you have every president walking through a sort of a short course in American history.
Our White House is young by the standards of other homes of heads of state around the world, yet it's so central to our nation in every way, going back to 1800 when the Adams first moved in. How did the White House come to be where it's located here in Washington, and how did it come to have the actual design that it has?
George Washington felt very strongly that a house should be almost a stage set for the person who lives there if it's someone of distinction. And if you question that he felt that way, go over to Mount Vernon. There's almost not a single room, not a single view that was not carefully planned out by George Washington to convey a political idea or even just the way he liked to live. And he felt that that was even more true of the White House. So there was a competition among architects, about 9 or 10 of them. George Washington, who was sort of an amateur architect, was very much involved himself. One of the submissions was from Thomas Jefferson anonymously. Jefferson did not make it, but the one who did was James Hoban. And Washington not only chose Hoban, but he spoke to him and he sort of bargained with him over Hoban's design, which in that case Washington thought was not quite grand enough for the president. But Washington felt very strongly that this should be a building that if you knew nothing else about America, it would convey some important things. Simplicity, democracy, some grandeur.
So how does this American executive mansion compare with homes of heads of state around the world?
You compare it to many other countries, even countries a lot smaller than we are and a lot less important geopolitically. And oftentimes you will have a chief of state or a chief of government from another country come here and say, I never dreamt that the White House would be so tiny. It's smaller than our palace, and it's certainly smaller than something like Buckingham Palace or the Elysee Palace. Washington and his contemporaries thought that was wonderful because it showed a kind of simplicity that basically said, we do not want to be like the monarchies of Europe.
You've studied every American president and have known many personally. Who are the presidents and first ladies, and maybe their families, who've had the most significant, lasting impact on the White House, and whose legacies are the most important in that regard?
Well, you sort of have to think of the White House largely in terms of the families who have changed it. And so you'd have to begin with the family of James Monroe, who changed, along with his predecessor, James Madison, changed the White House from being burnt in 1814 by the British, restored it, and not only restored it so that presidents could and their families could move in again, but restored it so that it was even more beautiful than it had been before because Monroe had been a diplomat to France, negotiated the Louisiana Purchase, had this wonderful collection of French furniture of that period, so it sort of lifted the general level of the White House even just in that moment. You particularly go into the Blue Room, and that's sort of the capital of Monroeiana. And it harkens back to his time as not only a diplomat in France, but he felt it was important for Americans to remember our closeness to France and the central role that the French played in helping us win our independence at the time of the Revolution. And that connected perfectly with Jacqueline Kennedy, who came from a largely French family. She studied at the Sorbonne. She loved French paintings and furniture. And so she felt strongly that it's nice to sort of exalt the legacy of James Monroe, but it gave her a great excuse to smuggle a lot of French things into the White House, which she liked aesthetically anyway. And it also led to her appointing an architectural designer who was a Frenchman, whose name was Stéphane Baudin, who has a lot to do with the way that the state floors of the White House look. You know, they look, in certain cases, a little bit regal, but particularly French regal, and especially the curtains of the time, you know, some of the fabrics and some of the spaces. If you look at, for instance, the gold torchères in the front hall when the president and first lady come down on a ceremonial occasion. If you were a Martian, I think you would think you were more likely in Paris or Versailles than in Washington, D.C. And Jackie Kennedy knew that politically it would not be too helpful for someone from another country to be the mastermind of the way the White House is being transformed. So Baudin did much of that work and did it pretty much in anonymity.
It's incredible to think that Mrs. Kennedy, who inspired our founding 55 years ago, was only 31 years old when she became First Lady and served, due to tragic circumstances, only 3 years in that role. And yet some say that the association and our work is her living legacy in historic preservation. Tell us how you see her in that way, and is that the legacy that you think carries on through our work and in other ways today at the White House?
Oh, very much. She loved what she did, and she gave this famous tour on television to the White House in February of 1962. You know, most Americans had never even heard her voice before this tour, in which she was explaining what she was doing and showing some of the rooms. So at that point, and JFK was always worried that Americans would see this as sort of effete and elite, and here she was raising all this money, you know, for expensive-looking furniture. But when she did that tour on TV, Americans were proud, and it made them feel better about the country, and she had no problem of that kind. What she was worried about was that it was likely that not every First Lady who followed her would feel as strongly about this as she did. So one of her reasons in establishing our association was to make sure that there was sort of an institutional encouragement to new first families who maybe, you know, don't feel so strongly about White House history, to essentially say, this is part of your mission too.
As a member of our board of directors, you're part of the leadership governance of the White House Historical Association. Being a little self-serving in this question here, but what does our organization mean to you, and what do you believe are the most important parts of our historic mission and our work?
Well, you know, the idea of the White House as a world-class museum, which it is, at least the state floors, that doesn't really date back to the time of George Washington. He wanted this to be a distinguished place, but it was really Jacqueline Kennedy in 1961 who said, this is me talking, not her, but it's sort of her idea. Why do I have to go to Versailles and then come back to the White House and feel that the White House is not up to that standard, especially since after World War II, the United States has become a world power of great importance. So she was the one who basically said, wonderful that we have the historical White House that's still standing over all these years, but there's not much of a collection of paintings or furniture or artifacts. And she was dealing with the fact that Harry Truman, who nobly between 1948 and 1952 moved out of the White House into Blair House, gave up the chance to live in the White House, which he had campaigned very hard for in 1948 because it was essentially crumbling. And so the superstructure was rebuilt and the physical structure was there, and that was a great accomplishment of Truman. But it cost too much, and in the end, there was so little money that Truman had to make a deal with the department store in New York, B. Altman, a bulk deal for a lot of reproductions, which looked fine. But to Jacqueline Kennedy, it looked like a hotel, and it really did. So she was the one who really turned it into a museum and said, let's try to just improve this all the time. And that was the inspiration for our association. What we try to do is, not freeze it in time as it was in 1963 when she left, but as you well know, because you're so important to what we're doing in this, we're always trying to look for pieces of furniture that once were in the White House and somehow drifted away, and paintings that belong there, and artifacts, so that every single year we're more and more a distinguished museum.
You were very helpful to the White House Historical Association and First Lady Laura Bush when we worked with her to redo the Lincoln bedroom. Tell us a little bit about that project and about it being a bedroom now, but not always a bedroom.
Sort of a metaphor for what we all try to do in constantly making the White House better. What is now known as the Lincoln bedroom was actually Lincoln's office at the time that he was president. And it was Harry Truman who said, we really should remember Abraham Lincoln. And so Lincoln furniture was brought into that room, artifacts, at least one important document, with the idea that here's something where you can really have the sense of being in the room with Abraham Lincoln. And you did have that sense because of all the things that were in the room, but it was sort of like being in a room with Abraham Lincoln, but the room was in a Statler Hilton hotel somewhere in the 1950s, because it was basically a white room that if Lincoln had come back, he wouldn't have recognized a bit, because, the early 1860s, this was deep into the Victorian era. And so what the White House Historical Association did, and Laura Bush and the others who worked with all of us, was to sort of take that back into a moment so that if Abraham and Mary walked into that room, they would find it fully recognizable as a room of their time.
One of the works that the association undertakes and supports is the acquisition of the official portraits, the White House portraits of modern presidents and first ladies, and these are actually a key part of the White House collection itself. Historically speaking, I'm going to put you on the spot here. Which of the presidential and first lady portraits are your favorites, and why?
Favorites? I love the one of Woodrow Wilson, which was done around the time that he was thinking very seriously of the League of Nations, and you just look at that and he looks as if he's meditating about that. Lyndon Johnson's portrait is fairly small, and there's a reason for that. Number one, it's not the first portrait that was painted for Lyndon Johnson's official portrait. There was one by Peter Hurd that was done in 1967. Johnson took one look at it and said, this is a verbatim quote, "That's the ugliest thing I've ever seen." And as a result, that did not make it as Johnson's official portrait. And the other thing is that LBJ was told that if your portrait is fairly small in size, you have a better chance of it being displayed in a prominent place in the White House. If you've got a big portrait, you may not wind up, in the front hall. You may wind up somewhere else, which is not seen quite as much. So Johnson, who was a great person in many ways, did not have a tiny ego, thought better to go for the small portrait and be seen, and so it has turned out to be.
Tell us about the Kennedy portrait.
The Kennedy portrait, actually both of them, those were very much Jackie Kennedy's idea. And that's another example of a portrait that replaced an earlier one that didn't quite make it. The first portrait that was painted of John Kennedy was painted 1966, 1967 by Jamie Wyeth, which I find quite powerful. Bobby Kennedy looked at it and said, it makes Jack look too irresolute. It looks as if he's nervous after the failure of the Bay of Pigs or something like that. And so it was supplanted by the one that was done by Aaron Schickler. That's what that portrait is today. Jacqueline Kennedy's portrait, if you look at it, it conveys exactly her mood at that moment, and the moment was 1968. Her husband had been murdered. Her beloved brother-in-law, Robert Kennedy, had been assassinated that same year. She was feeling very intense and to some extent angry about what had happened. And if you take a look at that portrait, those two eyes almost like laser beams. And in fact, the portrait that we now see in the White House was instead of a sketch of another portrait that was even more intense. Later on, I don't know this, my guess is that she would look back on that portrait and say, that represented the way I felt in 1968, perhaps not the way I would have done it later on. That's just my guess.
So I'm going to unpack your personal interests here in perspective a little bit. And if you could go back in time and actually be present at the White House for key historical events that have happened in our nation's history, what would those be?
Well, I'm prejudiced. I come from Illinois, and if I did not say Abraham Lincoln, I'd never be let back inside my home state. But I would love to be in a room where Abraham Lincoln and his family were, preferably at a meal in the White House. And the main reason for that is not because we don't know a lot about Lincoln, because from the moment that Lincoln died, everyone knew that this is a president of greatness and consequence. So an awful lot about Lincoln's life, especially as president, is known. You know what he said, you see written descriptions of the way things looked. But there's no substitute for actually being in the room and to be able to be as sort of a silent person in the room, watching Abraham Lincoln and how he related to his wife and his children and what they looked like at a meal and, you know, how they basically enjoyed the White House. That would tell you a lot that we don't know. As you know, Stuart, I did 2 books on these tapes that were made by Lyndon Johnson of his private conversations. And before we all had access to those tapes, you know, there were a lot of people who wrote about Lyndon Johnson and you could read his speeches, but not the same thing as hearing him talk and hearing Gunsmoke on TV in the background, this Western and, you know, other sound effects really takes you into the historical moment. And that's what we lack for so many presidents, especially Lincoln.
We all have thoughts and ideas of what we imagine American presidents were like. And yet they all have a personal side and a family, and they live in this place upstairs, out of the sight of visitors and meetings and ceremonies. If you could experience the family life of a president, who would you like to get to know better in that personal side of their life?
I think probably many people would choose Theodore Roosevelt because all those kids, and they would have been all screaming, and one famously took, I think, a donkey up in the elevator, and, you know, it was always wild. But also that had a lot to do with the way the White House is nowadays, because when the Roosevelts moved in 1901, Theodore Roosevelt and his wife said, we've got all these kids. This is a big family and a rambunctious family of a kind that you've rarely seen in American history. And that means maybe it's a good idea to move the president's office and the other offices that are on the second floor, the family floor, out somewhere else. And so as a result, that was a very good reason to build, especially the West Wing, with presidential offices that were outside the residence. And the result was that this was, for the first time, the second and third floors became really a family place, which they had not been before.
Staying with the thought of presidential families, you've also known a lot of children of presidents and witnessed them growing up in the White House. From the child's perspective, your father is President of the United States. What is growing up in that house like for a child of an American president?
You're brought up amid all this publicity, and your friends, if you're a young person, hard to know whether people like you for yourself or because your father is the president. And in a way, it sort of says something about the families where the kids were able to grow up fairly normally. And one thing you can say about a number of presidential families is that you had a strong president, in most cases a strong first lady, who basically said, I'm going to have to make an enormous effort to protect these kids from publicity and from manipulative people. And it sort of tells you a little bit about the character of the people who serve there.
And like all families, we have happy times and we have sad times. I know that this year is the 50th anniversary of the wedding in the East Room of Lyndon Johnson Robb and Senator Robb, who was a military aide at the White House. And 8 of our presidents have died while in office, and certainly a few presidential children. Tell us a couple of key thoughts, instances in your mind of life and death in the White House, and how the House itself has been impacted by those significant historical occasions.
Well, one poignant story is when John Kennedy was murdered, 22nd of November, 1963. Jacqueline Kennedy stayed in the White House until the 7th of December. That was about as small a period of time as she could manage to suddenly get her things together and move out. And when she moved out, she moved to Georgetown with her children, Caroline and John. And so she was living in Washington for about the next year. And she was understandably so stricken with this horrible experience that she had been through that when she was being driven by the Secret Service through Washington, she would tell them, make sure that you take a route where there is no chance I can glimpse the White House, because she thought that would be just too painful. And she basically said, as much as I loved living in the White House and as much as I was involved in trying to improve the White House, I don't think I can bring myself to go there ever again. And as it turns out, she did. And what happened was, when her portrait was done by Aaron Schickler, and the same thing done with her husband's portrait, the Nixons were president, John Kennedy's old political adversary, and they basically got in touch with her and said, what do you want? Do you want a ceremony? And she quietly communicated with the Nixons and said, I don't think I could do that, and this is going to be very painful, but essentially I owe it to Jack to come back and view the paintings in place. So they arranged it so that there could be a private viewing, and the Nixons would have her and her children to dinner. Press wouldn't know about it until they were gone, and the secret held. And the Nixons were lovely about it, and they looked at the paintings, and Richard Nixon showed John Kennedy Jr. the place where his father's desk had been in the Oval Office, were the famous pictures of John climbing out from underneath. And Jacqueline Kennedy wrote to Richard Nixon afterwards. She said, the day that I had always dreaded turned out to be one of the most precious days I've ever spent with my children.
Oh, what a compelling story. We know of President Lincoln and President Coolidge both losing sons while they were president, and they themselves grieved for the loss in their own family. Tell us about what we know about their grief and how they carried on their official responsibilities as presidents of the United States while they were grieving the loss of their own sons.
Abraham Lincoln was subject to depression for all sorts of reasons above and beyond the Civil War. But when he was in the White House, here he was commander-in-chief, presiding over the deaths of hundreds of thousands of Americans. And he once said to a friend, can you think of me, who could not even stand to see a chicken being killed, presiding over this ocean of blood? And so then, his beloved child Willie died early in that presidency. It not only added to Lincoln's grief, but Mary Lincoln, who also had some instability and also all sorts of demons herself, this to some extent drove her almost over the edge. So you had Lincoln dealing with one of the greatest problems, most severe problems a president has ever had to deal with, the secession of the South, and trying to find some way to get through the Civil War at the same time as he's dealing with this family torture of a lost son and a wife who is, absolutely at her wit's end. Everything he had to deal with, and he would essentially open the door of his bedroom, and he'd be in his nightcap and his long gown, and there'd be 90 people in the hallway waiting to bother him about getting a job for their brothers-in-law or changing the military strategy of the Civil War. And as tormented as he was for all sorts of other reasons, he really had no peace, to the point that Lincoln had to spend about 4 months every summer at a cottage up the hill from the White House where it was cooler, but he was trying to get away from all this. And so if you had a White House where the president could not feel, any sense of calm, especially in wartime, that meant it wasn't doing its job.
In the foyer of the White House, between the foyer and the Cross Hall, there are 4 dates that are embedded in the White House floor there: 1792, 1817, 1902, and 1952. Why are those dates there and in that significant place that it's very difficult to miss as you walk through the White House? And what do those dates represent?
Those are dates that I would have chosen if I were here in 1952, which I wasn't. But begin with 1792. That was the start of the design of the White House when George Washington was thinking about this and conferring with the architect he chose, James Hoban. 1817, that's when James Monroe and his family were, reestablishing a presidential family inside this building that had been burned by the British, and as I mentioned earlier, bringing in these wonderful French pieces of furniture and artifacts. 1902, I'm for that too. That's when Theodore Roosevelt and his wife came in and not only put on the wings of the White House, but also when they came in, this was deep in late Victoriana. If you walked in the north entrance, you would see a Tiffany glass screen, which it's very nice, but doesn't have a lot to do with American history. The rooms were very gloomy, very dark floral wallpaper. You look as if you were locked in about the year 1892 and could never get out. And so basically, the Roosevelts had most of these rooms painted white or a neutral color, and the idea was that those would be sort of a neutral background for pieces of furniture and artifacts. And if you needed something that shows how important that vision was, go take a look at the East Room of the White House nowadays. Compare that to the East Room that the Roosevelts created in 1902. It's almost the same. Every presidential family has felt that they really sort of got it. And then finally, 1952, that was the year after that huge Truman gut renovation. Everything was torn out except for the 4 outside walls, new basements dug, steel superstructure, air conditioning was put in, new kitchen, new bathrooms. Truman created the shell for this museum that Jacqueline Kennedy really began to establish.
There's a funny story I recall hearing about the straw that broke the camel's back with Harry Truman that led him finally to, okay, we must move out and let this significant renovation take place. What was that story?
Well, he knew that there were troubles because, you could be on the second floor and sometimes literally the floor would begin to sort of wobble a little bit. And there were 2 things that happened. One was that Margaret Truman had, I think it was a baby grand piano, and at one point, one of the legs of this piano went through the floor. And the other was that Truman began to worry when he was taking a bath upstairs that sort of the same thing would happen. And he said, I'm worried that one day I'm going to be taking a bath in this bathroom and, distinguished visitors are going to be downstairs in some chamber below. And suddenly the bathtub will crash through the ceiling and there I will be naked in my bathtub. So that helped encourage him to move out and let the White House be restored.
And during that Teddy Roosevelt renovation, the state dining room took on some characteristics that were pretty unique Teddy Roosevelt. Tell us about that.
That's for sure. It was great in the state dining room as long as your appetite was not ruined by seeing a lot of animal heads on the walls. And he was also big on animal skins, so that if you walked into the Blue Room, there was a big tiger rug with a big open mouth with a lot of teeth. And Mrs. Roosevelt, after TR's death, said, "I love my husband, but all those staring eyes of all those animals."
That's a great story. But tell our listeners something that they may not know about the White House. One last nugget of insight here.
Well, one thing they may not know is that we've all tried to work very hard to make this as historic as possible and very much of a museum. But if you go into a number of the bathrooms still upstairs, you are walking into 1952 because they've not been particularly restored. So in a way, I think that's probably a good thing in many ways, because I think we should honor Harry Truman for allowing the White House to physically survive and be what it is today. And you go into one of those bathrooms and you really think I'm living here in 1952 when Harry Truman was president.
And what would Abraham Lincoln think if he were to walk in today's White House? Or what would George Washington, who conceptualized this great but simple American executive mansion, what would they think of the house as it exists and operates today as an office and as a home, as a ceremonial stage, and as a museum?
I think if they came back, they would be astounded that the house looks so much like what they recognized. You know, I do not want to put words in George Washington's mouth, far be it from me, but I think that if he were to imagine what America would be like 200 plus years later, you know, you have to think that he would have thought that this White House, assuming that the country survived and flourished as he expected, would have far outgrown this house, which is big to most people, but he would have figured that the march of technology and expansion of the federal government and so forth. And I think it's really testimony to the fact that modern presidents have felt that it has been so important to sort of stick with George Washington's ideal of making this as modest and simple as possible within reason, that we've sort of stuck to the original plan.
And if Mrs. Kennedy were to walk into the north door of the White House today and through those historic rooms, would she recognize what she had done in the White House? Would she be inspired what's happened since her time as First Lady?
I think she would absolutely love it. She would love the fact that her vision of keeping this as a world-class museum of American history had prevailed. And she also would feel good about the fact that later first families tried to change it and improve it. As I mentioned, she was only in the White House once between the assassination and the time that she died in 1994, which was the time that she went back to see the Nixons and her and JFK's portraits. And Pat Nixon took her through the rooms, and Mrs. Kennedy said to Mrs. Nixon, "I love the fact that you have not just tried to sort of freeze things as they were in 1963. I love the fact that, you know, you're acquiring new things and that they don't necessarily look the way these rooms, the way that I did them in 1963, and I hope it'll always be that way," she said.
One of the many things that I love about my role here and the privilege of being at the White House Historical Association is you learn something new every day, and learned many things listening to you
Thank
today.
you, Stuart. Well, same thing with me.
Thank you, Michael Beschloss, for joining us today for the 1600 sessions and talking about why the history of the White House is important. Thank you for sharing with us your insights and your knowledge, and we look forward to many future conversations with you, and thank you for your leadership with the White House Historical Association. It's greatly
My
appreciated.
pleasure always, Stuart.
Great. Thanks so much.
You've been listening to the 1600 Sessions. This podcast is presented by the White House Historical Association and produced by Long Story Short Media. You can subscribe or download new episodes at the1600sessions.org. And you can help others find this podcast by rating and reviewing us on iTunes. Thanks again to Michael Beschloss. And thank you to the U.S. Marine Band Library, which provided the music for this podcast.